the shadow of Yggdrasil. The village of Skaldheim lay nestled in a valley surrounded by dense, ancient forests. The air was perpetually thick with mist, and the sun rarely pierced through the towering pines. At the edge of the village stood a massive, gnarled oak tree, its branches twisted and bare, as if frozen in a perpetual scream. The villagers called it Yggdrasil's shadow, a name whispered with both reverence and fear. Legends spoke of the tree as a gateway to the realms of the old gods, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, but no one dared to approach it, not after the disappearances. Eira, the village healer, was a woman of quiet strength. Her auburn hair was often tied back in a loose braid, and her green eyes held a depth of knowledge far beyond her 25 years. She had come to Skaldheim as a child, brought by her brother Sigrid after their parents died in a fire. But Sigrid had vanished near Yggdrasil's shadow 5 years ago, leaving Eira alone with her grief and unanswered questions. Tonight, the village was unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of crackling fires and distant laughter were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Eira sat by the hearth in her small hut, grinding herbs into a paste, when a frantic knock shattered the stillness. Eira opened the door to find old Thorgrim, his face pale and his hands trembling. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes darted toward the forest. Thorgrim, gripping her arm. "Eira, you must come quickly. It's happening again." Eira, calmly. "What's happening, Thorgrim? Speak clearly." Thorgrim, voice shaking, the shadows, they moved. Near the tree. "I saw him, your brother. He was there, but he wasn't himself." Eira's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Sigrid, but she forced herself to remain composed. She grabbed her satchel and followed Thorgrim to his cottage on the outskirts of the village. The old man's home was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of burning herbs. He pointed to the window, where the silhouette of Yggdrasil's shadow loomed against the moonlit sky. Thorgrim, whispering, "I was tending to the goats when I saw it." A figure, cloaked in shadows, standing beneath the tree. It turned toward me, and I swear it had Sigrid's face. But its eyes, they glowed like embers. Eira, frowning, "You've been drinking too much of your own brew." Thorgrim, "Sigrid is gone. The tree is just a tree." Thorgrim, desperate, "No, child. The old gods are stirring. I felt in my bones. You must believe me." Eira sighed, patting Thorgrim's shoulder. She gave him a sleeping draught and promised to look into it, though she doubted there was any truth to his ramblings. As she walked back to her hut, the forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows deeper and more menacing than usual. She quickened her pace, her boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. When she reached her doorstep, she froze. A small, rune-carved stone lay at her feet, its surface glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. She knelt to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the intricate symbols. As she did, a cold wind swept through the village, carrying with it a whisper, a voice that sounded like her name. Eira, muttering, "This can't be real. It's just my mind playing tricks." The whisper, echoing, "Eira, come to me." She spun around, her heart pounding, but the village was empty. The wind died down, and the stone's glow faded. She clutched it tightly, her mind racing. Could Thorgrim have been telling the truth? Was Sigrid truly out there, calling to her from the shadows? As Eira stepped inside her hut, the ground beneath her trembled. A low, guttural growl echoed from the forest, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced at the rune stone in her hand, its symbols flickering faintly. The whispers were real, and they were calling her name. She knew she couldn't ignore them any longer. Tomorrow, she would go to Yggdrasil's shadow and uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The Wanderer's Warning. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick canopy of trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the village of Skaldheim. Eira stood at the edge of the forest, her satchel slung over her shoulder and the rune stone clutched tightly in her hand. The whispers had haunted her dreams all night, and she knew she couldn't delay any longer. She had to find out what was happening at Yggdrasil's shadow. As she turned to leave, the sound of hooves clattering against the cobblestone path made her pause. A stranger rode into the village on a black horse, its coat glistening with sweat. The man was tall and lean, his face partially hidden beneath a hooded cloak. A staff adorned with raven feathers rested across his back, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to see straight through her. The villagers watched him warily, their whispers carrying on the wind. Strangers were rare in Skaldheim, and this one carried an air of danger. Eira felt a strange pull toward him, as if fate itself had brought him here. The stranger dismounted and approached the village square where Eira stood. His gaze locked on hers, and he spoke in a voice that was both commanding and calm. "Stranger, you feel it too, don't you? The pull of the tree." Eira, narrowing her eyes, "Who are you?" Stranger, smirking, "My name is Kael, and you, healer, are in more danger than you realize." Eira's grip tightened on the rune stone. "What do you know about the tree?" Kael, leaning on his staff, more than most. "Yggdrasil shadow is no ordinary tree. It's a prison, a place where the old gods were sealed away centuries ago. And now, something is stirring beneath its roots." The villagers murmured among themselves, their fear palpable. Eira stepped closer to Kael, her voice low. "What does this have to do with me?" Kael, his tone serious, "Everything. The rune stone you carry, it's a summons. Odin himself has called you to the tree. But heed my warning, the gods are not to be trusted." Eira's heart raced. How did he know about the stone? She glanced at the villagers, who were now backing away, their faces filled with dread. She turned back to Kael. "If you know so much, then tell me this. What happened to my brother?" "He vanished near that tree 5 years ago." Kael's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked almost sympathetic. "Sigurd, wasn't it? He was brave but foolish. He tried to bargain with the gods, and they took him. If you go to the tree, you'll share his fate, unless you let me help you." Eira hesitated. She didn't trust Kael, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. The rune stone, the whispers, the shadowy figure Thorgrim had seen, it all pointed to something far beyond her understanding. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Fine, but if you're lying to me, I'll make sure you regret it." Kael led the way to the edge of the forest, where the path to Yggdrasil's shadow began. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so thick that barely any light filtered through. The air was cold and heavy, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. As they walked, Kael explained more about the tree and the gods. "The old gods were betrayed by their worshippers," he said. "When the people turned to new beliefs, the gods grew angry. They demanded sacrifices, and when the people refused, they were sealed away. But their power lingers, and they've been waiting for someone to break the seal." Eira frowned. "And you think that someone is me?" Kael, nodding, "The rune stone chose you. It's a key of sorts, but whether you use it to free the gods or keep them locked away is up to you." Eira's mind raced. If the gods were as dangerous as Kael claimed, why would Odin summon her? And what did Sigurd have to do with all of this? She was about to ask more questions when a rustling in the bushes made her stop. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger at her belt. Eira, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Kael, gripping his staff, "Stay close. The forest is full of things that don't belong in this world." They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the shadows. The rustling grew louder, and suddenly, a figure stepped into the path. It was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, but its eyes glowed with an eerie light. Eira, gasping, "Sigrid?" Kael, pulling her back, "That's not your brother. Not anymore." The figure raised a hand, and the rune stone in Eira's grip began to glow brighter. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, but they were overwhelming. As the figure advanced, Kael stepped in front of Eira, his staff glowing with a faint blue light. "Run," he shouted. But before Eira could move, the ground beneath them trembled, and the forest seemed to come alive. The shadows twisted and writhed, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Eira realized too late that they were no longer alone. and that the tree was watching. The blood oath. The forest was alive with shadows, twisting and writhing like living things. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the whispers that had haunted Eira now swirled around her like a storm. The figure before them, cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing like embers, stood motionless, its hands still raised toward the rune stone. Eira's heart pounded as she stared at it, her mind torn between hope and fear. Could this truly be Sigrid? Or was it something else wearing his face? Kael stepped in front of her, his staff glowing with a faint blue light. The runes carved into the wood pulsed in rhythm with the whispers, and his voice was low but firm. Kael, stay behind me. Whatever this is, it's not your brother anymore. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them, and then it spoke. Its voice was a hollow echo, both familiar and alien. Eira, you've come at last. Eira's breath caught in her throat. It was Sigrid's voice, but it was wrong, distorted, as if coming from the depths of a bottomless well. She took a step forward, but Kael blocked her path. Kael, harshly don't. It's a trick. The gods are trying to manipulate you. Eira, desperate. But what if it's really him? What if he's been trapped here all this time? Kael, grim. Then he's beyond saving. The tree has claimed him. The figure extended its hand, and the rune stone in Eira's grip flared with a blinding light. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and images flooded her mind. Sigrid, standing beneath the tree, his face twisted in agony. The old gods, their forms shifting and monstrous, reaching out to her, and the tree itself, its roots sinking deep into the earth, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. Pleading, Sister, you must free them, or they will consume us all. Eira, tearful. Sigrid, I don't understand. What happened to you? Figure, voice breaking. I tried to save them, but they took me. They're trapped, Eira. Trapped and angry. You have to break the seal. Kael, snarling. Enough. She's not your pawn. Kael raised his staff, and a burst of blue light shot toward the figure. It recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame, and let out a guttural scream. The ground beneath them trembled, and the shadows around the tree began to coalesce, forming shapes that were neither human nor animal. Eira stumbled back, clutching the rune stone to her chest. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices begging, demanding, threatening. She felt a pull, a force drawing her toward the tree. Kael grabbed her arm, his grip firm. Kael, fight it, Eira. The gods are trying to control you. Eira, struggling, I can't, it's too strong. Kael, urgently, you have to. If you give in, they'll use you to break the seal. The consequences will be catastrophic. Eira closed her eyes, focusing on the sound of Kael's voice. She thought of Sigrid, not the shadowy figure before her, but the brother she had known, kind, brave, and always protective of her. She thought of the villagers, of Thorgrim's terrified face, and of the story she had heard as a child about the old gods and their wrath. She couldn't let them win. With a deep breath, she opened her eyes and stepped forward, holding the rune stone out in front of her. The figure, Sigrid, watched her, its glowing eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. Eira, firmly, tell me what I need to do. Voice trembling, a blood oath. Cut your palm and place your hand on the tree. The rune stone will do the rest. Kael, horrified, Eira, no. A blood oath is irreversible. Once you make it, you'll be bound to the gods forever. Eira, resolute, I don't have a choice. If this is the only way to save Sigrid, to save everyone, then I'll do it. Kael's expression darkened, but he didn't try to stop her. Instead, he tightened his grip on his staff and turned to face the shadows, which were now closing in around them. Kael, grim, then do it quickly. I'll hold them off. Eira pulled a small dagger from her belt and pressed the blade to her palm. The pain was sharp but fleeting, and as the blood welled up, she placed her hand against the rough bark of Yggdrasil's shadow. The rune stone flared with a brilliant light, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The ground beneath her feet split open, and a deep, guttural growl echoed from the depths. The figure, Sigrid, smiled, but it was a smile filled with sorrow. Figure, thank you, sister, but you've only delayed the inevitable. Before Eira could respond, the figure dissolved into shadows, and the tree began to shake violently. The roots pulled free from the earth, and the air was filled with the sound of cracking wood and rushing wind. From the depths of the tree emerged a monstrous wolf, its fur black as night and its eyes glowing with a fiery rage. It was Fenrir, the beast of legend, freed from its prison. Kael raised his staff, his face pale but determined. "Kael!" shouting, "Eira, run! Now!" But Eira stood frozen, her hands still pressed against the tree. The rune stone was burning hot now, and the whispers had turned into a single, commanding voice. "You've awakened us, child. Now you will serve us." As Fenrir lunged toward them, Kael grabbed Eira and pulled her away from the tree. The ground beneath them crumbled, and the forest seemed to come alive with shadows. Eira realized too late that she had made a terrible mistake. The gods were free, and they were far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Fenrir's wrath. The forest was a maelstrom of chaos. The ground trembled beneath Eira's feet as Fenrir, the monstrous wolf of legend, emerged from the depths of Yggdrasil shadow. Its fur was black as the void, and its eyes burned with a fiery rage that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and decay, and the shadows around the tree twisted and writhed like living things. Kael pulled Eira away from the tree, his grip firm but trembling. His staff glowed with a faint blue light, but it was no match for the sheer power radiating from Fenrir. The beast let out a deafening roar, its voice shaking the trees and sending a flock of ravens scattering into the sky. Eira stumbled, her mind reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The rune stone in her hand was still warm, its light flickering like a dying ember. She clutched it tightly, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and regret. "Eira," gasping, "what have I done?" "Kael," urgently, "there's no time for that now. We need to move." Fenrir lunged toward them, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from where they had been standing. Kael raised his staff, and a burst of blue light shot toward the beast, momentarily blinding it. But Fenrir shook off the attack with ease, its glowing eyes locking onto them with a predatory focus. Dialogue. "Kael," gritting his teeth, "we can't fight him. He's a force of nature." Eira, desperate, "Then what do we do?" "We can't just run." Kael, grim, "We don't have a choice. Fenrir is just the beginning. If the gods are free, they'll unleash chaos on the world. We need to regroup and find a way to stop them." Eira's mind raced. She thought of Sigrid, of the shadowy figure that had claimed to be her brother. Had it all been a trick? Had the gods used her grief and desperation to manipulate her into breaking the seal? She felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear as Fenrir let out another roar and charged toward them. Kael grabbed Eira's arm and pulled her into a run. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and bending to block their path. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Eira's lungs burned as she struggled to keep up with Kael, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind them, Fenrir's growls grew louder, and the sound of snapping branches and crashing trees echoed through the forest. Eira glanced over her shoulder and saw the beast gaining on them, its massive form tearing through the underbrush like a storm. Eira, panting, "We can't outrun him." Kael, determined, "We don't have to. Just trust me." Kael veered off the path, pulling Eira into a narrow ravine. The walls were steep and covered in moss, and the air was damp and cold. They stumbled over rocks and roots, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. At the end of the ravine was a small cave, its entrance partially hidden by a curtain of ivy. Action. Kael pushed Eira into the cave and turned to face Fenrir. The beast was close now, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Kael raised his staff, and the runes carved into the wood began to glow brighter. He muttered an incantation under his breath, and a barrier of blue light formed at the entrance of the cave. Fenrir slammed into the barrier with a force that shook the ground, but the light held. The beast let out a furious roar, its claws scraping against the invisible wall. Kael's face was pale, and his hands trembled as he struggled to maintain the spell. Kael, straining, this won't hold him for long. We need to find another way out. Eira, looking around, there's no other exit. We're trapped. Kael, grim, then we'll have to face him. Eira's heart sank. She knew they were no match for Fenrir, but she couldn't let Kael face the beast alone. She tightened her grip on the rune stone and stepped forward. Eira, determined, if we're going to die, we'll die fighting. As Fenrir continued to batter the barrier, Kael began to chant again, his voice rising in pitch and intensity. The runes on his staff glowed brighter, and the air around them crackled with energy. Eira felt a surge of power emanating from the rune stone, and she realized that it was responding to Kael's spell. She held the stone out in front of her, and the light from the runes merged with Kael's barrier, creating a blinding explosion of energy. Fenrir let out a deafening howl as the light engulfed him, and for a moment, it seemed as though the beast had been defeated. But then the light faded, and Fenrir emerged from the smoke, his fur singed, but his eyes burning with an even greater fury. The barrier shattered, and Kael fell to his knees, his strength spent. Kael, nodding, then let's make it count. As Fenrir lunged toward them, Eira closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to the old gods, begging for their mercy. But the only response was the sound of the beast's roar and the knowledge that they were out of time. The Hall of Forgotten Gods. The cave was plunged into darkness as Fenrir's massive form loomed over Eira and Kael. The beast's breath was hot and rancid, its glowing eyes like twin suns in the shadows. Eira clutched the rune stone tightly, her mind racing for a way out. Kael, weakened from maintaining the barrier, struggled to stand, his staff trembling in his hand. Just as Fenrir's jaws snapped shut, a blinding light erupted from the rune stone. The air around them crackled with energy, and Eira felt a sudden pull, as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. The world twisted and blurred, and for a moment, she was weightless, suspended in a void of light and sound. When the light faded, Eira found herself standing in a vast, crumbling hall. The walls were made of ancient stone, covered in moss and ivy, and the ceiling stretched so high that it was lost in shadows. The air was cold and heavy, and the only light came from faintly glowing runes carved into the walls. At the far end of the hall stood a massive throne, its surface blackened and cracked. Sitting on the throne was a figure cloaked in shadows, its single eye glowing with an eerie light. Eira turned to Kael, who was now standing beside her, his expression a mixture of awe and dread. Eira, whispering, "Where are we?" Kael, grim, the Hall of Forgotten Gods. This is where they were imprisoned, and where they've been waiting. The figure on the throne rose, its form shifting and changing as it moved. One moment, it was a tall, regal man with a long beard and a cloak of raven feathers. The next, it was a shadowy wraith with glowing eyes and a crown of thorns. It was Odin, the All-Father, but not as the stories had described him. This Odin was broken, his power diminished, but still radiating an aura of menace. Odin, voice echoing, "You've come at last, child. We've been waiting for you." Eira, stepping forward, "What do you want from me?" Odin, smiling darkly, "You've already given us what we wanted. Your blood oath has weakened the seal, and soon we will be free. But there is still much to be done." Kael stepped in front of Eira, his staff raised. Kael, defiant, "You won't use her. I won't let you." Odin, chuckling, "Brave words, mortal, but you're no match for us." The hall began to shift, the walls closing in and the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. Eira felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. She looked at Odin, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Eira, if you're so powerful, why do you need me? Why not break the seal yourself?" Odin, narrowing his eye, "Clever girl. The seal was made by mortal hands, and only a mortal can break it completely. Your blood oath was the first step, but there is more to be done." Eira's mind raced. She needed to buy time, to find a way to outsmart the gods. She glanced at Kael, who gave her a subtle nod. They were in this together, and they would find a way to stop Odin and the others. Eira, firmly, what happens if I refuse? Odin, smiling darkly, then your world will burn. The seal is already weakened, and without your help, it will collapse entirely. The consequences will be catastrophic. Eira felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Odin wasn't bluffing. The gods were desperate, and desperate beings were dangerous. She needed to think fast. As Odin stepped closer, Eira noticed something strange. The runes on the walls were flickering, their light growing dimmer. She realized that the gods' power was fading, that they were weaker than they appeared. She turned to Kael, her voice low. Eira, whispering, they're not as strong as they seem. We can use that. Kael, nodding, but we need to be careful. One wrong move, and we're dead. Odin raised his hand, and the shadows around them began to coalesce, forming into monstrous shapes. Eira tightened her grip on the rune stone, and Kael raised his staff, ready to fight. But before they could act, a voice echoed through the hall, a voice that was both familiar and filled with sorrow. Sigurd's voice, echoing, Eira, don't trust them. They're lying. Eira turned, her heart pounding. Sigurd's spectral form appeared beside her, his face pale and his eyes filled with regret. Sigurd, pleading, they used me, just like they're trying to use you. Don't make the same mistake I did. Odin's expression darkened, and he raised his hand, sending a wave of shadows towards Sigurd. But before the shadows could reach him, Kael stepped in, his staff glowing with a brilliant light. The shadows recoiled, and Odin let out a furious roar. Odin, snarling, you dare defy us? Kael, defiant, we're not your pawns, and we're not afraid of you. Hook. As the hall began to collapse around them, Eira realized that they had only one chance to escape. She grabbed Kael's hand and held the rune stone out in front of her, focusing all her energy on the runes. The light grew brighter, and the air around them crackled with energy. But as the world began to blur, Odin's voice echoed in her mind. Odin, voice echoing, you can't run forever, child. We will find you. The betrayal. The world twisted and blurred as Eira and Kael were pulled from the crumbling hall of forgotten gods. When the light faded, they found themselves back in the forest, near the base of Yggdrasil shadow. The tree loomed above them, its gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers that had haunted Eira since the beginning now swirled around her like a storm. Sigurd's spectral form stood beside them, his face pale and his eyes filled with regret. He looked at Eira, his voice trembling with urgency. Sigurd, you must destroy the rune stone. It's the only way to stop them. Eira clutched the stone tightly, its surface warm and pulsing with an otherworldly light. She glanced at Kael, who was watching Sigurd with a mixture of suspicion and concern. Kael, narrowing his eyes. How do we know we can trust you? The gods have already used you once. Sigurd, pleading, I was a fool to believe them. They promised me power, but all they gave me was pain. I won't let them do the same to you, Eira. Eira's mind raced. She wanted to believe her brother, but the gods had already proven themselves to be masters of manipulation. She looked at the rune stone, its runes glowing faintly, and felt a surge of doubt. Eira, softly, if we destroy the stone, what happens to you? Sigurd, smiling sadly. I'm already gone, Eira. This is just an echo. But if the stone is destroyed, the seal will be restored, and the gods will be trapped once more. Kael stepped forward, his staff glowing with a faint blue light. Kael, grim, it's not that simple. The stone is tied to the tree. Destroying it could unleash a power we can't control. Sigurd, urgently, it's the only way. The gods are already breaking free. If we wait any longer, it'll be too late. Eira, torn, I don't know what to do. If we destroy the stone, we might make things worse. But if we don't, Kael, placing a hand on her shoulder, we need to think this through. There has to be another way. Before they could decide, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The whispers grew louder more insistent, and the air was filled with the sound of cracking wood and rushing wind. Eira turned to see the tree splitting open, its roots pulling free from the earth. From the depths emerged a figure cloaked in shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It was Odin, his form shifting and changing as he stepped forward. His single eye burned with an eerie light, and his voice was a low, guttural growl. "Odin," snarling, "you cannot escape us, child. The blood oath binds you to us. You will serve us, willingly or not." Eira felt a surge of anger, and she stepped forward, clutching the rune stone tightly. "Eira," defiant, "I'm not your pawn. I won't let you use me." Odin, smiling darkly, "Brave words, but you have no choice." As Odin raised his hand, the shadows around them began to coalesce, forming into monstrous shapes. Eira tightened her grip on the rune stone, and Kael raised his staff, ready to fight. But before they could act, Sigrid stepped in front of them, his spectral form glowing with a faint light. Sigrid, pleading, "Eira, destroy the stone." Now, Eira hesitated, her heart torn between saving her brother and stopping the gods. But as the shadows closed in around them, she knew there was no other choice. She raised the rune stone high above her head and brought it down with all her strength, smashing it against the base of the tree. The rune stone shattered, and a blinding light erupted from the fragments. The air was filled with a deafening roar, and the ground beneath them split open, revealing a chasm of darkness. The shadows recoiled, and Odin let out a furious scream as his form began to dissolve. Odin, voice echoing, "You've only delayed the inevitable, child. We will return, and next time, you won't be so lucky." As the light faded, Eira fell to her knees, her strength spent. The tree was silent, its branches still and lifeless. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. As Eira looked up, she saw Sigrid's spectral form fading, his face filled with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Sigrid, softly, "Thank you, sister. But this isn't over. The gods are still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to break free." The final stand. The forest was eerily silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of the rune stone's destruction. Eira knelt on the ground, her hands trembling as she stared at the shattered fragments of the stone. The tree, Yggdrasil's shadow, stood lifeless and still, its gnarled branches no longer twisting like skeletal fingers. But the silence was deceptive. Eira could feel it, a lingering presence, a darkness that hadn't fully dissipated. Kael stood beside her, his staff glowing faintly, his eyes scanning the shadows. Sigrid's spectral form had faded, but his final words echoed in Eira's mind. The gods are still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to break free. Eira rose to her feet, her voice shaky but determined. "Eira, we need to warn the village. If the gods are still out there, they'll come for us, for everyone." Kael, grim, "The village won't stand a chance. We need to find a way to stop them for good." Before they could move, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low, guttural growl echoed through the forest, and the air grew colder. Eira turned to see Fenrir emerging from the shadows, his fur singed but his eyes burning with an even greater fury. The monstrous wolf let out a deafening roar, and the forest seemed to come alive with movement. Kael, gritting his teeth, "He's back. And he's not alone." Eira, wide-eyed, "What do you mean?" Kael, pointing, "Look." Eira followed his gaze and saw shadowy figures emerging from the trees, creatures that were neither human nor animal, their forms shifting and writhing like living shadows. The gods were sending their minions, and Fenrir was leading the charge. Kael raised his staff, and the runes carved into the wood began to glow brighter. He muttered an incantation under his breath, and a barrier of blue light formed around them. But the creatures slammed into the barrier with a force that made it flicker and waver. Kael, straining, "This won't hold them for long. We need to fight back." Eira tightened her grip on her dagger, her mind racing. She thought of the villagers, of Thorgrim's terrified face, and of Sigrid's sacrifice. She couldn't let the gods win. Not after everything they'd been through. Eira, determined, will hold them off. For as long as we can. Kael, nodding, then let's make it count. The barrier shattered, and the creatures surged forward. Kael swung his staff, sending bursts of blue light toward the shadows, while Eira slashed at them with her dagger. The air was filled with the sounds of snarls and screams, and the ground was slick with black ichor. Fenrir lunged toward them, his massive jaws snapping shut just inches from Eira's face. She rolled to the side, her heart pounding, and Kael stepped in, his staff glowing with a brilliant light. He struck Fenrir across the muzzle, and the beast let out a furious howl. As the battle raged on, Eira noticed something strange. The creatures seemed to be drawn to the fragments of the rune stone, their forms flickering and fading as they passed over them. She realized that the stone's power was still lingering, and that it could be used against the god's minions. Dialogue. Eira, shouting Kael. The stone fragments, they're weakening the shadows. Kael, nodding, then let's use them. Eira grabbed a handful of the fragments and threw them at the nearest creature. The shadowy figure let out a piercing scream as the light from the runes engulfed it, dissolving it into nothingness. Kael did the same, using his staff to scatter the fragments and create a barrier of light. Fenrir, enraged by the loss of his minions, charged toward them with a deafening roar. Kael raised his staff, but the beast was too fast. It knocked him to the ground, its massive paw pinning him down. Eira screamed and lunged forward, plunging her dagger into Fenrir's side. The beast let out a guttural howl and turned on her, its glowing eyes filled with fury. But before it could strike, a blinding light erupted from the fragments of the rune stone. The light engulfed Fenrir, and the beast let out one final, ear-splitting roar before dissolving into shadows. As the light faded, Eira fell to her knees, her strength spent. The forest was silent once more, but she knew it wasn't over. The gods were still out there, and they would return. She looked at Kael, who was struggling to his feet, and whispered, "We need to prepare. This is only the beginning." The last whisper. The village of Skaldheim was eerily quiet, the aftermath of the battle with Fenrir and the shadowy minions still fresh in the air. The forest, once a place of mystery and dread, now felt hollow, as if the life had been drained from it. Eira stood at the edge of the village, her eyes fixed on the horizon where Yggdrasil's shadow once loomed. The tree was gone, reduced to ash and splinters, but the weight of what had happened lingered like a storm cloud. Kael stood beside her, his staff resting against his shoulder. His face was grim, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet determination. They had survived the battle, but the cost had been high. Sigrid was gone, the rune stone was destroyed, and the gods were still out there, waiting for their chance to return. Eira turned to Kael, her voice soft but steady. "Eira, what now? The gods aren't gone. They're just waiting." Kael, sighing, "We bought ourselves some time, but you're right. This isn't over. We need to prepare for what's coming." The villagers had begun to emerge from their homes, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. Thorgrim approached them, his eyes wide with disbelief. Thorgrim, whispering, "Is it true? Did you really face Fenrir? Did you stop the gods?" Eira, gently, "We stopped them for now, but they'll be back. We need to be ready." Kael, to the villagers, "Gather everyone. We need to fortify the village and prepare for the worst." Thorgrim, nodding, "We'll do whatever it takes. But what can we do against gods?" Eira, firmly, "We'll find a way. We have to." As the villagers began to rally, Eira and Kael retreated to her hut to plan. The air inside was heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke, and the remnants of the rune stone lay scattered on the table. Eira picked up a fragment, its surface cold and lifeless. Kael leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "Kael, the rune stone was just a key. The real power lies in the gods themselves. If we can find a way to weaken them, to trap them for good, we might have a chance." Eira, frowning, "But how? We don't even know where they are." Kael, grim, "We'll have to find them. And when we do, we'll need more than just luck to stop them." Eira's mind raced. She thought of Sigrid, of the sacrifices he had made, and of the villagers who were counting on her. She couldn't let them down, not again. She looked at Kael, her voice filled with determination. Eira, then we'll find them, and we'll finish this. As they prepared to leave the village, a sudden chill filled the air. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, and Eira felt a familiar pull. She turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the forest, a shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes. It was Sigrid, his spectral form flickering like a dying flame. Sigrid, softly, Eira, you can't fight them alone. You'll need more than strength. You'll need wisdom. Eira, tearful. Sigrid, I don't know what to do. I'm not strong enough. Sigrid, smiling sadly. You're stronger than you think. But you can't do this alone. Trust Kael. Trust yourself. Before Eira could respond, Sigrid's form began to fade, his voice growing softer. Sigrid, whispering, thank you, sister. But this isn't goodbye. I'll always be with you. As Sigrid's form dissolved into the air, Eira felt a surge of determination. She turned to Kael, her eyes filled with resolve. Eira, let's finish this. Eira and Kael set out into the forest, their path lit by the faint glow of Kael's staff. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. But Eira refused to be afraid. She had faced the gods once before, and she would do it again. As they reached the ruins of Yggdrasil's shadow, the ground began to tremble. The air was filled with the sound of cracking wood and rushing wind, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Eira tightened her grip on her dagger, her heart pounding in her chest. From the shadows emerged Odin, his form shifting and changing as he stepped forward. His single eye burned with an eerie light, and his voice was a low, guttural growl. Odin, snarling, you cannot escape us, child. The blood oath binds you to us. You will serve us, willingly or not. Eira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Eira, defiant, I'm not your pawn. I won't let you use me. Odin, smiling darkly, brave words. But you have no choice. As Odin raised his hand, the shadows around them began to coalesce, forming into monstrous shapes. Eira tightened her grip on her dagger, and Kael raised his staff, ready to fight. But before they could act, a blinding light erupted from the fragments of the runestone. The light engulfed Odin, and the god let out a furious scream as his form began to dissolve. As the light faded, Eira fell to her knees, her strength spent. The forest was silent once more, but she knew it wasn't over. The gods were still out there, and they would return. She looked at Kael, who was struggling to his feet, and whispered, we need to prepare. This is only the beginning. Echoes of eternity. The forest was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The ruins of Yggdrasil's shadow lay scattered across the ground, the once mighty tree reduced to ash and splinters. Eira knelt amidst the debris, her hands trembling as she clutched the last fragment of the runestone. The battle with Odin had left her drained, both physically and emotionally, but she knew it wasn't over. The gods were still out there, their presence lingering like a shadow on the edge of her mind. Kael stood beside her, his staff glowing faintly, his face etched with exhaustion. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but steady. Kael, we did it, Eira. We stopped them for now. Eira, whispering, but they'll be back. They always come back. Kael, nodding, then we'll be ready. We'll find a way to keep them sealed for good. As they rose to their feet, the air around them began to shift. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, and Eira felt a familiar pull. She turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, a shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes. It was Sigrid, his spectral form flickering like a dying flame. Sigrid, softly, Eira, you've done well. But this isn't the end. Eira, tearful. Sigrid, I don't know what to do. I'm not strong enough. Sigrid, smiling sadly. You're stronger than you think. But you can't do this alone. Trust Kael. Trust yourself. Before Eira could respond, Sigrid's form began to fade, his voice growing softer. Sigrid, whispering, thank you, sister. But this isn't goodbye. I'll always be with you. As Sigurd's form dissolved into the air, Eira felt a surge of determination. She turned to Kael, her eyes filled with resolve. Eira, let's finish this. Eira and Kael set out into the forest, their path lit by the faint glow of Kael's staff. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. But Eira refused to be afraid. She had faced the gods once before, and she would do it again. As they reached the ruins of Yggdrasil's shadow, the ground began to tremble. The air was filled with the sound of cracking wood and rushing wind, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Eira tightened her grip on her dagger, her heart pounding in her chest. From the shadows emerged Odin, his form shifting and changing as he stepped forward. His single eye burned with an eerie light, and his voice was a low, guttural growl. Odin, snarling, you cannot escape us, child. The blood oath binds you to us. You will serve us, willingly or not. Eira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Eira, defiant, I'm not your pawn. I won't let you use me. Odin, smiling darkly, brave words. But you have no choice. As Odin raised his hand, the shadows around them began to coalesce, forming into monstrous shapes. Eira tightened her grip on her dagger, and Kael raised his staff, ready to fight. But before they could act, a blinding light erupted from the fragments of the rune stone. The light engulfed Odin, and the god let out a furious scream as his form began to dissolve. As the light faded, Eira fell to her knees, her strength spent. The forest was silent once more, but she knew it wasn't over. The gods were still out there, and they would return. She looked at Kael, who was struggling to his feet, and whispered, "We need to prepare. This is only the beginning. We need to prepare. This is only the beginning."